Now I have to start off by saying I'm sorry that this likely won't be as exciting as you're expecting, but I can say it's 100% true. Let me start off by saying I'm a 21-year-old male from British Columbia, Canada, and I've spent most of the free time in my life outdoors, in one way or another. This took place several months ago now, right before winter started for real. I had a couple nights to myself this particular weekend and decided I would go for one last camping trip before it got too cold to sleep outside anymore. I texted some buddies to see if anyone wanted to tag along, but in the end, I ended up going into the bush solo. There's plenty of good forestry roads around where I live, so we'd usually just drive up a dirt road until we found a nice spot and camp there, which is exactly what I did, in a spot I'd camped before, no less. Anyways, I got my fire going, set up my tent and sleeping bag, and kicked back to start drinking my little night away. I was having a great time for the first couple hours. It was late in the season, so the sun was setting early, but I had enough wood to keep a fire all night, and enough beer to keep up. I'd camped solo many times before, so I really didn't mind loosening up a bit. However, I didn't get that chance. I don't remember falling asleep or what time it even would have been. I just remember waking up around 9 p.m., still sitting in my chair before the fire, with the deepest feeling of dread I've ever felt in my life. The fire was still going strong, so I couldn't have been asleep for long, but I had this unshakable feeling that something was watching me. Bears would have been in hibernation at this point, and I know what it feels like to be watched by a coyote. This was something different. I decided the big beer I'd had to drink was clearly enough, and tried to shake the feeling. I got my good knife and flashlight ready, just for good measure, as I sat with my back to the fire, looking into the tree line, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something up there, just waiting for me to slip up. I was getting tired again after a while, but I knew I wouldn't be comfortable in a tent, so I decided to drop the back seats and sleep in the hatch of my car. At least I could lock the doors that way. Again, I have no idea what time I went to sleep, but eventually I managed to, until I woke up from the most vivid, horrifying dream I've ever had. I saw myself from a third-person perspective, sleeping in my folding chair in front of the fire. Exact same camping spot, exact same details as the scene I'd woken up from not even an hour before. As I watched myself sleep in the chair, slowly the glowing eyes of coyotes emerged from the trees until they surrounded and ate me. I woke up in a cold sweat with a worse dread than I'd felt before. I had felt being eaten by the dogs, and at that point, I didn't even know what was a dream and what was real. I just knew I needed to get off the mountain. I left everything set up in a campsite and crawled into my front seat to drive back down the road. On my way down, I saw one single deer stare at me, and as I passed it, it walked to the middle of the road and watched me drive away. I went back the next morning to get my camping gear, and nothing was out of place. But those dreams and that deer still haunt me if I think about them too long. I'm not sure if it was truly a skinwalker or just the rural paranoia of growing up in a small town, but I tell you, I never look at deer the same anymore. This is a story my family told me when I was growing up. We live in a rural community on a Navajo reservation. My aunt and her two brothers were home alone, while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and my uncles were getting ready for bed. Outside, they heard noises, as if someone moving things around outside. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window, and saw a figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary, because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncles were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out the rifle and all steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off in the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked toward the light and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran toward the truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking out its head to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed over the gun and placed an ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired toward the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. My grandma chased my aunt inside, and my uncles and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased after the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. Not only that, whoever it was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared, and that he knew it was her, and to leave his family alone. A few days passed, and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who the Skinwalker is, say their name, and it will kill them. My friend's Skinwalker story. Back in college, a buddy and I were hanging out in our dorm room, smoking some weed and chilling. We get on a topic of creepypastas and stuff, and I mentioned that I've heard some really creepy Skinwalker stories. My buddy gets really quiet out of nowhere. I saw one once, up close and personal. That shit is real, bro. Of course I asked him to tell me more. He said he didn't like talking about it, but eventually he opened up. So his story took place back in the summer before he left for college. Him and his high school friend group had planned a big, last hurrah camping trip. He was from Scottsdale, Arizona, and I think he said they only drove a good hour and a half outside the city, to one of their friends' parents' ranching properties. There's about 8 people in their group, and everyone shows up around the same time in 3 separate cars. Around when they show up, it's already starting to get dark, so they set up their tents and a campfire and start drinking and smoking. This one dude in their group, let's call him Tim, is being a little more quiet than usual. My buddy asks him what's wrong, and he says something like, "I don't feel good, just a little under the weather today." Regardless, they start making brats and are all having a good time. Then, out of nowhere, everyone notices Tim is gone, just totally vanished. Nobody even saw him leave, even though everyone was relatively close to the fire. The group starts calling his name, thinking he's pranking everyone. Then they start to get worried once Tim has been gone for over an hour. So my friend and a couple others go out into the hills to search for him. They walk around for a good 15 minutes calling his name before they finally get a response. It's not Tim. Instead, they hear the familiar howl of a coyote, and it's answered by a couple other coyotes. My buddy says he was a little worried at this point that Tim might have gotten dragged off by the wild animals. Everyone in their group was paranoid because there's no way Tim could have gone missing without anyone noticing. There's just no way. They hear another howl suddenly. It's longer than the others and different in that it sounds off, like if someone had a recording of a coyote howling and decided to play it. My friend's blood ran cold when the howl ended in a sort of hacking laughter, and unlike the howl, the laughter sounded close, like 20 feet away close. The friend group starts frantically looking around, convinced Tim is out there fucking with them. But he isn't. They don't see anyone. They return to the fire a little shaken up. Everyone is starting to get worried at this point. The group starts considering calling the police when suddenly a truck pulls up to the campsite. It's Tim's truck. Tim steps out of it and is wondering why everyone has been freaking out. Tim says he's sorry he got off work 2 hours late and hurried out to the ranch as fast as he could. This is when the group realizes that Tim didn't carpool there with anyone. As if on cue, they hear another long, drawn-out howl just like the other one. At that point, the group noped the fuck out of there. They ended up paying to camp in a designated campground, and the night went on as normal. But my friend still says he thinks about when he asked Tim if he was alright. He claims that at the time, he could definitely tell something was off about Tim, but didn't think anything of it. But now he's 100% convinced that Tim was some sort of skinwalker entity impersonating his friends just for shits and giggles. How the creature knew what Tim looked like and sounded like, well, he has no explanation for that. Maybe it just got inside their heads.